Hi everyone, welcome to this video about a lesson on diffusion. This is currently down as the last lesson in the particles and energy scheme of work, generally to be taught to year 7. And if you've been watching any of the other videos, or if you've been looking at this scheme of work before, you may notice that this is a relatively recent addition. And the reason was we didn't have a specific lesson on diffusion in the curriculum. We kind of covered it within other lessons on, for example, the alveoli or the small intestine and the villi and so on. But we decided that actually it'd be really helpful to have a kind of standalone lesson on diffusion, and we put it in the particles energy scheme of work before it comes up in those biology schemes of work, and it fits nicely with the particle model. And this is going to be a really simple explanation of diffusion, and students can develop a much more sophisticated understanding of the concept when they study it in biology. This is just introducing some new words like concentration and so on, and just getting the basic idea that if you've got high concentration, low concentration, well, you're going to get this net movement from one to the other. And this is a lesson where I think a visualizer diagram is absolutely brilliant. What I often see when I see this taught is that classic one with the perfume or the deodorant, and the teacher kind of stands at the front and they spray something in one corner, and then all the students sniff it and they go, oh, that's interesting. And you know, it's very fun. And then students give a definition of diffusion and they say, right, it's the movement from high concentration to low concentration, partially permeable membrane, and so on. What do the students actually go away with in terms of memory? Well, they remember that lesson where the teacher sprayed something, and oh yeah, what was that definition of diffusion? I can't quite remember. And actually, what we want to do in this lesson, by drawing diagrams under the visualizer, is give them a really clear picture of what's going on in terms of these concepts that link all of the lessons together through the particles and energy scheme. So the way I like to do this is to start, I kind of use a metaphor. And again, as with all these videos, there are probably much better ways of doing this. This is just a suggestion, a starting point. But I like to imagine that what you've got is a canteen in here with lots of students. So here's our canteen. And there are, well, in fact, yeah, there are lots of doors like this. At the moment, the doors are closed. There are lots of doors in the canteen like this. That look like so. Now, inside the canteen, we've got lots of students. I'm going to draw those quite close to one another. They're all kind of packed together, just sort of randomly arranged. And you might want to add that they're kind of moving around and so forth. So you can imagine maybe it's wet break or something like that. And there's lots of students in the canteen, all zipping around all over the place, and it's a bit chaotic. So I won't add all the arrows, but hopefully you get the idea, and students will get the idea. Like so. And this is what's going on. And outside the canteen, what we've got here is the playground. But at the moment, the playground is completely empty because, yeah, maybe it's wet lunch and all the students are stuck in the canteen. But what happens next is the teachers decide, well, maybe it's not raining anymore, so they're going to open the doors. So I might just rub out those in here and illustrate this to students. So we're going to open these doors like this, and hopefully you can see what we're trying to get at here, this idea of a partially permeable membrane. I don't know if this is the best metaphor, but it seems to work. And we want to ask students, well, okay, if you've got all of these students crammed in the canteen, but then the doors get opened, well, what would you expect to happen? And hopefully what they'll say is that something like this will happen, which is that students will start, students in the example will start to move out. So let's draw the same thing again with our 3 doors like this. Students will start to move out. So if I just move my camera down like this, they'll start to move out through the doors, and what you'll get is some students out here. But we've still got lots of students here, lots of students inside here, this, I'll add a few more. We've still got lots of students inside here. In hindsight, if I were to do this again, maybe I would have counted the number of particles just so it's really, really clear, but hopefully this illustrates it. And maybe I'm going to spread these out a bit more actually, just so it's really clear that this is a lower concentration. So I might get rid of those two and put one student's gone right to the corner and one student's only just made it out the door. And I think students will get the idea that particles, or sorry, students in this case, are going to move out of the canteen. And what you want to then elicit is this idea that, okay, this would happen, but would it just stop? Well, the point at which it kind of stops, and actually stop is the wrong word, we obviously need to be careful, we'll come back to that later. But the point you want to get to is that ultimately what's going to happen, and again, this is where the student metaphor might break down a little bit, but ultimately, if we keep going here, and I draw down a bit like this, well, what's going to happen is this. So if I draw my 3 doors again, like this, ultimately what happens is we get to a stage where about half the students are still in the canteen and half the students are out in the playground. I'm going to draw, and this is where you've got to try and draw a kind of similar concentration in either side. And we're not going to use the word concentration necessarily yet, but that's where we're going to get students to think about it in terms of concentration. And effectively, they're spread out pretty evenly. Now, obviously, in real life, students would cluster together and so on, so this is not the best metaphor. There's various ways it breaks down, but it is quite nice, because the other thing that you can illustrate with it is to say, well, when you get to this stage, there's nothing stopping this student from going back through this door, or this student going back through this door, but overall, over time, what you would expect is, for every student that's going back that way, you're going to have another student that's going back that way, and so on. And so here we bring in this idea of net movement, which we'll come back to later. So I quite like to start with that story. I think it's quite tangible. I think students, especially Year 7 students, can kind of make sense of it. Now what we do then is we go back and we say, well, let's think about this in terms of particles. So what we've got here in this situation is what's called a high concentration of particles. And the word concentration is probably cropped up at some point in the density lesson, so I think students will be relatively familiar with it, but here we can kind of give a really specific definition, which is it's kind of the number of particles within a certain space, let's say, if we want to be specific, within a certain volume. But this is a very high concentration over here, and this is a very low concentration. And you might, depending on your group, sorry, I've spelled that wrong. This is why I shouldn't talk and write. You might want to introduce this idea of concentration gradient if there's a huge difference between the concentration here and the concentration over here. That's what we call a large concentration gradient. And you can illustrate this by then comparing this top picture to the second picture and say, well, now we've still got a higher concentration. So I might put higher concentration. And a lower concentration. And I don't know if I've just introduced some ambiguity here. This is higher relative to this concentration, not relative to that concentration. But anyway, you can make that clear to your students. But what you want to illustrate here is, and you might do a check for understanding of the whole class here, is say, okay, which concentration gradient do you think is higher? Is that a bigger concentration gradient, or is that a bigger concentration gradient? And hopefully you can elicit the idea with your students that actually that is a bigger concentration gradient because the difference in concentration is greater. We should also notice that, what was I going to say? Yes, our example of the wall with the doors that open, this is the same as what we call a partially permeable membrane, and that allows some things through and not others. So we could label this as a partially permeable membrane, and get students to label it with us like that. And then we can say, well, okay, if we get this movement across, so what we saw from here to here was a movement of particles overall from this side over to this side. Well, that net movement of particles from the high concentration to the low concentration, that's what we call diffusion. And then we can come down to the bottom here, and I don't know whether my diagram's perfect, but it's okay. I think they're pretty even in terms of concentration. We can add labels here saying concentration or concentrations. We might say approximately equal, and you can explain to students, a bit like in the playground example, they might not necessarily be absolutely equal at all times, but overall they're generally going to be about the same. And again, you can illustrate this point that we said, well, students might go back and forth each way, but overall it cancels each other out. And you can say at this point, there is, if you've got this situation where as many are going that way as are going that way, you could add a note here and say something like 0 net movement. So I might put a label over here and put 0 net movement. And again, you can emphasize to students that at this point diffusion has stopped. Because you've got 0 net movement anymore, but that's not to say the movement of particles has stopped. So diffusion has stopped, or we can take it as the rate of diffusion is 0, but that doesn't mean there's no movement whatsoever. It's not that they're all static on each side. So that's a nice introduction, and hopefully I've covered all of the ideas that then come up in the deliberate practice. What you'll see in the lesson is the task is getting students to think in terms of this sort of language through the concentration and concentration gradients and so on. But then there's lots and lots of multiple choice questions, just getting students to identify in concrete examples which are the high concentration, which are the low concentration, in which direction is diffusion going to happen. So hopefully that video was useful, and again, as always with these videos, if you've got any suggestions on how to explain this concept even better, I would absolutely love to hear from you. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed teaching this lesson.